Joey Manu is set to be the latest rugby league player to depart the code and head for Union. He joins a long line of league players who depart the code in search of extra money and maybe a little extra fame. But almost always, these players get bored with Union and return to the sport that made them a star in the first place. If this is your first time on the channel, please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. For as long as League and Union have existed, there have existed players that have switched between the two codes. When the split initially happened in the late 1800s, Union ruled out players who moved to League. They were made persona non grata. If they played rugby league, they could never play Union again. But modern problems require modern solutions. And in the 1990s, as both codes became fully professional, well, they had to move with the times. Rugby league players no longer had to work a part-time job, and Rugby Union finally recognised that players were being paid under the table and just made it official. There was of course a lot more money available in Rugby Union in the late 90s as big business got involved while Rugby League was pulling itself apart with the Super League war. The lure of bigger dollars in Rugby Union became a draw that some could not avoid, and in the early 2000s there was something of an exit from Rugby League players heading to Rugby Union. Brisbane Broncos wingers and premiership winners Wendell Sailor and Lottie Takiri were probably the two biggest names in Australian Rugby League to depart the code for Union. They defected to Rugby Australia in the early 2000s, and they were the Wallabies wing pairing at the 2003 Rugby World Cup. Sailor had joined the Queensland Reds for the 2002 season, and Lottie Takiri had moved to the Waratahs in 2003. Probably the only time you're going to see Lottie Takiri happily wearing the sky blue. But they weren't the only players to make the switch. Also joining them in 2002 was Cronulla's Matt Rogers, and he would also appear at the Rugby World Cup with Australia playing at fullback. Brad Thorne also made the switch to Union. He headed back to his homeland of New Zealand, playing for the Crusaders and Canterbury in New Zealand Rugby Union. All four of them competed at the 2003 Rugby World Cup, and all four of them were former Maroons representatives at State of Origin level. None of them actually remained in Union until their retirement. Brad Thorne returned to rugby league pretty quickly. By 2005, he was back with the Broncos. He won another competition in 2006, saw out the 2007 season before returning to rugby union. Matt Rogers returned to league in 2007, becoming one of the foundation players for the Gold Coast Titans. And if anything, this return was actually what enshrined his legacy in the sport. He was a talented young player at Cronulla who played at the highest levels and followed in the footsteps of his father, Steve Rogers. But becoming a foundation player at the Titans during probably their most successful era was what really enshrined himself in the rugby league folklore. Playing as a 5'8" for the Titans, he partnered the likes of Scott Prince, Preston Campbell, and also played in sides featuring Luke Bailey, Anthony LaFranchi, and Greg Bird. Lottie Takiri stuck around in rugby union a lot longer. He actually went to the 2007 World Cup. But by the end of 2009, his time was done, and in 2010 he joined the West Tigers, when the Tigers were actually good. He spent a few years there, but then decided he wanted to win a comp again and went to South Sydney for their 2014 drought-breaking premiership before he sailed into retirement. And of course, out of all of those, Wendell Sailor had the more roundabout way of returning to rugby league in a very rugby league way. He got done for cocaine in 2006 and had to sit out of Australian sport for 2 years due to ASADA. In 2008, he returned to rugby league with the St George Illawarra Dragons. He won the 2009 minor premiership with them before retiring. In fact, his final game was in 2010 at the Indigenous All-Stars. As those early 2000s recruits were returning to rugby league and finishing off their careers, well, a new batch was heading over to Union. Tamana Tahu, who had spent time at the Newcastle Knights and Parramatta Eels, winning a premiership in 2001 and a minor premiership in 2005, he went to the Waratahs for 2 very injury-plagued seasons. He returned to the Eels in 2010 before he finished his career off with the Penrith Panthers and back to Newcastle. But perhaps the biggest defection of all was Sonny Bill Williams, who departed in very unceremonious circumstances in 2008 from the Canterbury Bulldogs, heading over to Toulon in the south of France. He was one of the best players in the NRL when he left, and it caused somewhat of a criticism storm. He had walked out on quite a large deal with the Bulldogs, and he was one of the best players in the competition at the time. And nothing really settled down until Toulon paid the Bulldogs about $750,000. Sonny Bill then became somewhat of a mercenary in 2 sporting codes that mortgaged their players' bodies. He swapped between both codes, kind of winning everything. In 2011, he won the Rugby World Cup with the All Blacks. And then in 2013, he won the NRL Premiership with the Roosters before he headed back to Rugby Union and with the All Blacks and won the 2015 Rugby World Cup. And as his career was winding down, he thought, what better place to wind it down than in rugby league? He had an ill-fated 5 games for the Toronto Wolfpack as they tried to move into the English Super League before finally completing his career with the Roosters in the 2020 COVID-interrupted season. Across his career, he won 2 NRL Premierships and won 2 Rugby World Cups. We can, of course, throw Israel Folau into this mix. I mean, he did go to AFL before he went to Rugby Union and became basically the one attacking outlet the Wallabies had. He tried to return to Rugby League with the Parramatta Eels, but the NRL overvalued his contract somehow, and that killed that suggestion dead because it would have broken Parramatta's salary cap. Not to worry, a few years later, they'd break the cap themselves without Israel Folau being anywhere near them. The next time he tried to return was very much at the end of his sporting career, and he didn't learn how to stop posting on social media. The NRL would not register his contract, and he ended up playing some local rugby league in Queensland. Now we are at the latest batch of rugby league players departing for Union and probably regretting it. We've already got Joseph Suaalii heading off to Rugby Union next year, and he was a very highly touted Rugby Union junior as well as being a rugby league player. Unlike the departures in the early 2000s rugby, Australia is in a very different place. Financially, they are struggling and they have next to no very visible footprint in Australia. If anything, they have gone backwards in the past 20 years since the 2003 Rugby World Cup when they were during their heyday, and you had the likes of Takiri, Rogers and Saylor filling out the Wallabies backline. How long until we see Joseph Suaalii returning to rugby league with his tail between his legs and a fat contract from the Roosters? Now his teammate Joseph Manu is likely heading to Union as well. And there's nothing inherently wrong with players chasing the dollars, especially Joey Manu, who really should be on the upper tier of pay packets in the NRL. However, due to the way the Roosters work their salary cap and the existence of James Tedesco, Manu is out playing in the centres when he really should be getting fullback money. It's reported that the Roosters are offering about $800,000 a season, whereas his fielding offers from Rugby Union well over $1 million a year. I guess the question here is how long until he returns to rugby league, if at all. His interviews recently have indicated he just wants to stick it out in Union for as long as he can and has no plans to return to the code if he does make the switch. It's very clear that this is about money because he's only fielding offers from teams in either Japan or in France, which rules out his New Zealand eligibility and he's not going to be playing for the All Blacks. He turns 28 next year, which, look, it's not the end of an NRL career. There's plenty of players that play well into their 30s, but it does call into question that if he spends a couple of years out of the code, could he actually return to rugby league? There's every chance that he spends a couple of seasons over in France, earns his money, James Tedesco retires, Manu returns to get fullback money in the NRL and see out his career with the Roosters. And as we've seen, sometimes money doesn't trump playing the greatest game of all.